This is Lane Becker. He is fantastic.
That's a great opening. Hey, everybody.
But let's get into more details. Phenomenal entrepreneur, serial entrepreneur, loves parties, but only when there's certain goals, which we'll talk about. And we talked the other day. Actually, I think I was flying 3,000 feet in the air, and you were somewhere else, and I saw a Twitter stream, I responded, and then we started talking. We haven't talked in a while. But this discussion is about the life of an entrepreneur, the roller coaster life of an entrepreneur, the good, the bad, the ugly, and hopefully...
Mostly about the ugly. I think we're mostly focusing on the ugly today.
Okay, we can focus on the ugly, but there's also, in that ugly, is a discussion about what's ugly and how we can do better, right? So it's a two-way street here. So for the audience to know, we've both been entrepreneurs for about the same amount of time, 18 years.
Yeah, around that, since the...
96, I think I saw?
Yeah, 96, 97.
Okay, so both of us about the same side. I went to the other side after my last company did well and then had an unfortunate disaster, which I blame myself. When we were growing a company, got to about a couple million in revenue. It was a SaaS platform. And we were trying to sell in June of 2008 with iBanker. And we had about a dozen people interested. In September of 2008, they all closed their doors and said no when the market crashed. And Diablo Management was hired to liquidate the company. That was actually the name, Diablo. So I tried to negotiate with the devil, honestly, to buy back the company, to survive it. And
it's truth in advertising right there.
It's really amazing.
They know what they're doing.
They do know what they're doing, but the bizarre part, and then enough about me, we're going to get to you, and then back and forth. The bizarre part, and actually Andy was at the board meeting, I believe, who's in the audience. Our typical board meeting was 7 people. Okay, normal investors and a couple of the founder and others. And this board meeting was about 25 people, including people on the phone. And we knew what was happening. It was announced within 6 hours that Diablo was going to come to the meeting. I didn't know who Diablo was. And all of a sudden, there was a discussion of liquidating the company, of what to do and what not to do, and manage liability.
And did it just kind of catch you? It blindsided you?
No, I was the chairman of the company, and we knew about it for, it was challenging for a couple of months, and we were being drip-fed funding. And it was a very, very tough time. But we thought we had a couple more months in money coming in, and that blindsided us. But that was a reality of that time. It was a disaster on funding. But I only asked one question for the first 2 hours. I really didn't talk during the board meeting, because it was the hall of shock. The only question I asked about 2 hours in, hour and a half in, was, I raised my hand and everybody got nervous that the founder didn't say anything. Obviously, we were partly in tears and frustrated and pissed that the dream was dying or could die. And my question was, Diablo? Where'd you get that name? And everybody started laughing. And they said, it's a mountain near our office. Bullshit. So we want to talk a little bit about, you've done a bunch of companies. How many?
3. I mean, if you want to go back to the stuff I did in college, 4 or 5, but I'd say 3 in the kind of classic internet startup space. One was a design consultancy. One was an analytics tool, an early analytics tool in the mid-2000s that we sold to Google. And then my most recent company, GetSatisfaction, which I think will be the subject of this discussion.
It'll be a majority of the subject, absolutely. So talk about GetSatisfaction. When you were starting it, or before you started, what was your goal? Why did you want to start that one?
Oh, it's a good question. Well, it was 2007, which was a lifetime ago at this point in internet years. It was funny, I was thinking back, kind of getting ready for this conversation, I was thinking back to all the stuff that didn't exist in 2007 when we were starting GetSatisfaction, like Facebook as any sort of platform that anyone used that wasn't a college kid, or Twitter, or SaaS, even the concept of SaaS. I remember actually that we went to, when we were originally pitching GetSatisfaction to First Round Capital, actually Rob Hayes from First Round Capital, who was our first investor early on in his investing career. I remember that I had a slide where I was showing this, like, the buying page from Basecamp, and I was like, I think we want to sell it kind of like these Basecamp guys do, where there's like 3 pricing tiers, and there's this one in the middle, and we just think that's a really great way. Like, we've never seen anybody sell like that before. We think it'll be a really great way to buy online. And I remember Rob, who is a wildly successful investor, going like, yeah, that'll never work.
And your response was?
He is a much better investor now. I think, we actually listened. I would say my entire experience of GetSatisfaction, I also want to take responsibility for the mistakes that we made. I could talk about the mistakes that we made all day.
We'll talk about some of those too.
But when it comes to our investors, I would say that the mistake that we made was that we listened a little too often.
So how do you choose when to listen? I had similar challenges as well. We all do. I mean, it's life.
I don't know. Thor, Amy, and I came up with what we call, that's Thor and Amy, they're a married couple, the Mullers, and we came up with what we call the Muller-Becker rule of investor advice, which is that you should always assume that the approximate percentage of advice that your investors give you that is correct is equivalent to the percentage of your company that they own. And good luck figuring out which percent that is. I don't think there's a great rule.
No, there's not. That's why I asked. Because you're smarter than me.
I think you have I've talked to a lot of people about how to manage boards since the experience of GetSatisfaction, and particularly the experience of not managing our board particularly well at GetSatisfaction. And I think it really comes down to just really knowing what it is that you believe in and what you care about, and making sure that that is represented, and then weighing all the advice that you get relative to that. I mean, these are people that are spending part of their time looking at what you're doing. You're spending all of your time looking at what you're doing. You're the one with sort of deep knowledge and deep experience in that area. So it's valuable, but you always have to gauge it against what is the core of what it is that I'm doing, and how do I apply it against that and decide. I realize that's really abstract. It's also almost impossible to do, right? Especially relative to your investors who, definitely have a sort of a power or authority position over you.
So, I think it makes a lot of sense, but I just realized we should probably just take a second back step.
Yeah.
So, what was GetSatisfaction in the beginning?
Yep.
How did, the goal of it, the funding that came in, and the recent outcome, which is what sparked our discussion when I was flying in the air and saw a Twitter stream discussion, which I thought was very valuable.
So GetSatisfaction was a customer service community platform. It started out, again, we came up with the idea in 2006, 2007, looking at online forums and seeing all the conversation that was happening about people that had products, and sort of sharing and having ideas and sort of sharing problems and getting solutions from other customers. And so the original idea for GetSatisfaction was a consumer site that was basically customer service without companies. How do we create a space where customers can, share ideas, answer questions, that sort of thing? And it did pretty well at that, actually, initially, early on. But very quickly, one of the things that we'd done is we'd created a mechanism for employees to, this is our little accidental growth hacking thing, what would now, I guess, be called growth hacking. We had created a way for employees to self-identify themselves, so they could come in and they could say, oh, I'm an employee of Yahoo, I'm an employee of Apple, whatever. There were no Apple employees that showed up. At least officially. I think there were plenty that showed up unofficially.
And I think there are people here unofficially, too.
Yeah. And we would give them a badge, and they would start answering questions alongside the customers. It was actually very effective. And this is, again, prior to Twitter and Facebook becoming customer service platforms. That was still just a twinkle in someone else's eye. So I think we were very directionally accurate in that sense about what the product needed to be, but kind of basing it on an old technology forums instead of thinking about where it needed to go. But the thing that did happen that was so interesting is that once the way that employees started finding out about us is we'd done a really good job on SEO on the pages, mid-2000s, SEO is still kind of a thing. And it turned out that all of these marketing and customer service types at all of these different companies had actually set up Google alerts for the name of their company, and we had made sure that the name of their company was very prominent on the page. So basically what we had developed is as soon as someone came in and asked a question about, say, a Samsung product, it was like having a direct line into all the marketing and customer service people at Samsung, because they'd all set up these Google alerts, and it was SEO, so it'd show up relatively high. So we developed this really fantastic, again, sort of growth hacking before growth hacking was a thing, way to get access to all of these people. And so suddenly we had all of these employees from all of these companies, some fairly high up, who were self-identifying and answering questions around these products. And that was the point at which at which we started having a conversation with Rob and some of the other folks on our board about, like, oh, maybe we should start to turn it in this direction. Maybe we should go back to that original idea we had about selling this as a product, as opposed to the place that we had initially pushed it based on our investor feedback, which was towards more of a sort of consumer environment.
Right. So at that stage, you were making how much revenue, and what was the...
Oh, yeah, we were making no revenue. I mean, this was the land of like, this is sort of dig era days of just like, how do you get big fast with a consumer platform?
Okay.
So much of this ends up being subject to the sort of vagaries of the moment. You know what I mean? What's the hot thing? What's the direction that everybody else seems to be going? Where can we pattern match today? And so we were kind of, flip-flopping around a little bit based on that. Personally, I think if we just sort of stuck with our initial idea of following the Basecamp model and getting into the SaaS approach earlier, I think we actually probably would have been much better shape in 2008, when everything tanked, right? And it's funny listening to your story and my story.
It's not really funny.
Okay, well, I'm going to go with funny because I have no choice but to laugh at this point. I've always dreamt of becoming. My childhood dream was to be a cautionary tale for others. So here we are, up on stage. So 2008, right? The economy tanks, and there are these macro conditions that have like fuck all to do with anything that any of you in the room are doing, right? I mean, we can blame 2008 entirely on a bunch of guys wearing ill-fitting suits sitting about a mile and a half that way. That way? That way? I'm lost, orientation-wise. Let's say that way.
That way.
Yeah, right? So, again, what they were doing was terrible and had nothing at all to do with what I was doing or with what you were doing.
Right.
But those macro conditions totally influenced our ability to succeed. In your case, it was your ability to sell. In our case, it was our ability to raise a Series A, which had been doing quite well up until that point. And suddenly, the money's not there, so I'm scrambling. I end up asking some of our sort of better off friends. I did all sorts of things to keep the company going through this period, asking people for money.
Tell us a couple of those things you did.
Actually, one of the things that I did, which was fantastic advice that I got from one of the guys that would later become our investor, this VC, Josh Felser from Freestyle.
Josh is great.
Josh is amazing. I would totally recommend taking money from him, and that's a very short list of people that I have for that.
You're an advisor of theirs as well.
Yeah, I was for their first fund.
And they're also an investor in Cameo, if Carter's here. There he is, right in the middle.
Yeah, that's right. Everybody likes Josh. Josh has this thing that he says, which I think every investor should say, but very few do. He says, we always have an agenda, but we promise to share it with you. So when he feels like his interests are going to diverge from your interests, he will point out how that is happening and why he is lobbying for something separate from you, which is terrific because there are always times that your investors are going to diverge in their interests from you, always, in every company.
Is that solely a personality trait, or is that because he's a serial entrepreneur?
I think it is a personality trait, but I also think it is both. Yeah, I've watched them win all sorts of investment opportunities based entirely on the fact that he's able to empathize with the people that he's talking to far more than somebody who's never actually run a business in their life. Mm-hmm. So he suggested actually that we have a dinner party and that I invite all my high net worth friends to come to the dinner party and basically just tell them hey, I'm pitching you on investment and dinner will be terrific, but if you're not interested in investing, we'll have other dinner parties, don't bother to show up. And he was like, and then 80% of the people won't show up and then 20% of them will, and the 20% that show up are all going to invest, which was completely 100% accurate. That is exactly what happened.
Wow. That's great.
It was, and it was again sort of. This is December.
Did you think
2008.
that would be Did you believe him, or was that I'll give it a try? I don't think it's going to happen. At that stage, it was kind of I'll do anything to try to raise capital to keep the company alive.
I was already in the I'll do anything to raise capital and keep the company alive place.
Yeah.
I was very much there. In fact, one of the this story has a very sad ending in which we sold GetSatisfaction cells to a company called Sprinkler about probably 6-8 weeks ago, and everybody. That isn't every investor, every employee, all of the founders get completely washed out. So none of us see a dime from the sale. The only people who make anything off of the sale are, interestingly, all the people who are still sitting on the board, investors, the current CEO and the former CEO. It's funny how that works. And actually, the mechanism by which that works is one of the things I want to talk about, just because we should get to that. Because one of the things I have observed through the experience of being more public about this than most people are when their company sells, but not really, is like how much opacity there is around. Like we have so much transparency in the sort of, and we talk about our world is so transparent and open, and it certainly is relative to, say, the way investing worked in the 90s, for example. But we're only transparent and open about things like the beginning. There's still a sort of a surprising shroud of secrecy and uncertainty around how things end when they don't end well, which is most of the time, or at least they don't end fantastically. And there are all sorts of, it turns out, like things that you need to know about that part too, including, for example, the way that we got screwed, which is one of the many ways you can get screwed in a sale where not everybody's going to see something from it.
So we'll talk about that in a second. Just let's lead up to it. You evolved your role at the company from what to what, when?
Well, I was always co-founder and chief product officer. I sort of became, I didn't actually take the CEO title, but Thor and I used to joke he was the CEO of the company. Mm-hmm. We used to joke that he was the peacetime CEO and I was the wartime CEO. He was really good when things were going well. I was really good when you needed somebody to get kind of pissed off in board meetings. So I I would say ran that piece of it, the sort of like the fundraising piece and everything that happened sort of post 2008. Although Thor was still very much the CEO of the company.
But then a couple years ago, you switched again, correct?
Yeah. Well, so then we ended up. So what happened to us post 2008 is we were basically told by our board, okay, it's great that you guys are having fun with this little consumer toy, but it's time to bring the adults in, right? So this is kind of classic Silicon Valley behavior. Prior to the sort of Zuckerberg, Sandberg, sort of, Andreessen Horowitz era, where the sort of 1-2 punch of Sheryl Sandberg coming in underneath Mark Zuckerberg instead of on top of him, which is what they would have done in years previous, and what they would have done, frankly, if Zuckerberg hadn't had Peter Thiel advising him on how to structure his board. It's true. I mean, he was 20. He would have gotten screwed if he hadn't sort of locked into some good advisors. And then Andreessen Horowitz opening up and saying, we believe in founders. We think founders need to stay in charge of their businesses. We think a good VC teaches a founder how to become an investor. That is all absolutely 100% true and came a couple of years too late for us. So in 2008, so in late 2008, they're basically like, you need to A, raise money, and like prove to us that you can raise money in this totally fucked up environment, or we're going to lose all faith in you. And oh, by the way, also we've lost all faith in you, and we think you need to get an adult in here. So those are sort of the messages.
It doesn't sound like it was an option. It was just it was a way of phrasing it.
There was right. I mean, the thing is, if I could go back and do it again,
so what would you do differently?
I would just tell them to fuck the hell off. Seriously. And you know what? I think that's kind of what they wanted me to tell them. I actually ended up having a conversation with Rob Hayes years later about Travis Kalanick, who, let's be honest, is like clearly the most successful asshole billionaire in the industry, right? So like really plays it to the hilt. So this is long before Uber is in any other city besides San Francisco. Rob Hayes, to his credit, was one of the seed investors at first round. So nice work, Rob. And he told me this story about Travis Kalanick that had really stuck with me, and this was after I had left GetSatisfaction in 2000, so probably like 2000.
So you left you were still on the board, or you weren't on the board?
I left. I got pushed off the board first in the Series A round, and then Thor got pushed off the board in the Series B round. But I have to tell this story because it's great, because I think it's important.
Go.
So Rob tells me the story about how there was a board meeting he needed rescheduled because he had a conflict. So he has his assistant call Travis. Travis probably didn't even have an assistant at the time. Call Travis and say, like, Rob needs to reschedule the meeting. And Travis says, fuck you. We're not rescheduling that meeting. I'm putting my time and energy into this. He needs to put his time and energy into this too. And Rob was like, I have so much admiration for Travis for doing that. And I realized, oh, that's how we fucked up. Like, Rob's a bottom. Like, clearly, that's what he wanted, was he wanted me to dominate him, because that's what venture investors want from you. So now my attitude towards this sort of thing is to go to like a BDSM metaphor. Thor, who was always the sort of more politic of the two of us, the three of us, Thor's take on it is that your investors are always testing you. And that was a test. And he was like, in that sense, we failed that test because in that moment, we weren't forceful or aggressive enough. We weren't doing the things that they needed to do to see that we were passionate or committed. And I actually think, as fucked up as that is, it's also totally, totally true.
I actually,
I do a lot of swear. I usually don't swear this much on stage.
No, it's good. Well, the subject is, relevant for swearing. I'm sure I could loft some out there as well, depending on the question you ask me.
All right. Well, apologies if you have
no.
ears.
The kid left earlier. Serge's kid is no longer here. That was Serge's kid that I invited and gave a little name tag if anybody didn't know.
Don't let me go talk to the
What is that, 3 weeks, a month old? Anyhow, so that brings up the point. So let's finish the story of the situation and go back to talking about investors and the crux of how you got screwed. All of a sudden it sells, the company, and you'd been out, so you probably had limited knowledge of what was going on. You're still a shareholder.
And I would argue deliberately incorrect knowledge of what was going on.
Okay. And you were out for how long, up until?
So I left in 2010, Thor left in 2011, and I believe Amy left in 2012 or 13.
Right. So over the last, 2 to 5 years.
Left.
Right. And still had equity, not a lot.
Still had equity, sort of an ever-increasing.
Decreasing, recapping, and other things.
I think by the end, probably the three of us collectively owned between 7 and 10% of the company, depending on the day.
Okay, and so then all of a sudden news hits that GetSatisfaction is sold.
Right.
Or tell me the story just before that, because I think there was some behind the scenes of, hey, sign this, do that. How did you find out, and then how did it evolve to all of a sudden having an extensive discussion with entrepreneurs around the world on Twitter?
Right. Well, this is where the story gets kind of gross and ugly.
And that's why I asked.
Yes.
I'm sorry, but that's why we're here.
I don't mind. What the hell? We're here. So we found out because we had maintained, even after sort of leaving the organization, we had actually maintained pretty close ties with a number of employees, which is I would recommend to everybody, even if and especially if you end up getting shoved out of your own organization. Employees on the ground are very, they usually, know what the hell's going on. In this case, we actually found out from an ex-employee who had also done the same thing, had maintained tight relationships. And apparently, the employees at GetSatisfaction had been explicitly informed not to tell any of the founders that the sale was happening because the current management, and I won't be more specific than that, had decided that I guess we were a liability in this situation, and they weren't going to tell us that the sale was closing until either, it's unclear to us, either exactly the day it was closing or perhaps the day after it had closed. So they had just sort of cut us out of the loop entirely. But this ex-employee had caught wind of it, and he had no reason not to tell us, so he just called us up and he was like, hey, FYI, your company's selling. That is just the shittiest way to find out that your company is selling. At the time, though, we assume, okay, well, we're probably getting washed out, right? Because why wouldn't they be telling us if they were going to get us even a little bit of capital? And now, up until this point, really, the only thing that we know is that, we know that revenues, our understanding has been that revenues had sort of leveled off. Right, and that we knew that they were struggling. We understood that they'd done a sort of a convertible note with really onerous preferences, 3x liquidation preferences, towards the end in an attempt to kind of keep things going. But again, they're sort of like happy, rosy in their conversations with us. What I understand now is that that convertible note with a 3x liquidation preference was there primarily to ensure that only the people that participated in that note were going to see anything from it, because they had done a successful job of hiding how badly, frankly, they had managed the business, how off a cliff the revenues appeared to have gone. And so they were all kind of in scrambling to make sure that they were going to get their money, right? Or they were going to be able to get something out of it. So that's what that last year actually was, not an attempt to sort of get the company back on its feet, but an attempt to basically steer it in a direction that was going to guarantee the maximum outcome for the people that still had some insight into what was happening, the people sitting on the board. So we find this out. Thor emails very politely the CEO and CFO and says, hey, you'd mentioned a while back that you were thinking about maybe acquisition or fundraising. How's that going? Can we maybe talk to you about it? Come in and talk to you about it. And one of them, the CEO or the CFO, writes back and says, yeah, why don't you come? We're really busy this week. Why don't you come in next Wednesday? And Thor's like, so funny story. We actually know what's happening, and we think you should bring us in much sooner. And then all of a sudden they're like, oh yeah, you should come in on Friday. Come in on Friday. So we go in on Friday, and we know that we're going to get washed out, right? I mean, there's no way that there's no way they would have been screwing with us as much as they were if we weren't going to get washed out. But we go in basically with an argument like, we think you should ideally, you should at least like recognizing that the common stock is getting completely washed out in this instance. We still think you should give something to the common. And even if you're not going to give something to the common, even if it's just like pennies on the dollar of the sale in recognition of all the people that have put so much time and effort into this. This, by the way, is not uncommon behavior, even in a situation where common gets washed out. Frequently, in order to maintain relationships or to sort of in recognition of the work that's been done or just to not look like an asshole, the preferred stock will actually throw something to common anyway. That's actually something that does happen. Not in this instance. We were like, okay, even if you're not going to give it to common, at least recognize that like we are the founders of this fucking business and we put a ton of time, energy, and capital into it, and we would like to see some small, even token thing out of this just in recognition of that. And hell, even if you're not going to do it because you're nice people, you should do it because why the hell else would we support this sale, right? Like, what is the point of us supporting this sale? And the CEO's like, oh, but it's your baby. Don't you want to see your baby make it out into the universe?
So it's his argument that it's either if you don't support it, it goes out of business.
His argument was suck it up, basically.
Okay.
So he basically says, okay, I'll go back to the board.
Right.
Oh, so the other thing we learned in this meeting on Friday, besides the fact that we're getting washed out, is that the sale is closing on Tuesday. And we were like, wait a minute, you told us you didn't want to talk to us till Wednesday.
Right.
Like, what? Jerk. So anyway. So
you probably used a stronger word than that. But we won't have to use it here.
No. There was this really funny part. Like the worst part about this meeting, right, is that like I go in, Thor goes in, Amy goes in, we go in, and we know that like the whole point of this meeting is for him to deliver us this sort of shit news that we've been washed out. But before he gets to that, the first 20 minutes of the meeting is spent with him grilling us on like which employee told you, which employee told you. Oh.
So let's jump to. That situation was horrible.
So
you decided.
So he says we're going to write the board.
Right.
The board basically comes back and says, no, we're not giving you anything. We're not giving common anything, but we do expect you to support the sale.
Right.
And it was in that moment that I realized, this happens. It's so frequent, right? So I end up going out on the morning of the sale. It's Tuesday morning. And this like congratulations note hits my phone and like wakes me up at 6 a.m. because this news has gone out on the wire that GetSatisfaction is sold. And all of my friends start doing the thing that you would totally expect them to do because they're your friends, right? Which is like they start sending me congratulatory notes. And I was just like not in the mood for it. So I wrote this thing on Twitter where I was basically like, which I have to say I did not expect to get the kind of pickup that it did, where I was basically just like, hey, everybody, I appreciate the sentiment, but like, don't congratulate me on the sale because the founders got totally washed out and we got nothing.
As you are a very genuine and sincere person, that's what the message was. But to everybody else, that's unusual in Silicon Valley.
I know.
Unfortunately. Or in most of the ecosystem.
No, I think that's I know that's accurate, actually, because one of the very... I don't know if amusing is the right word, but one of the really fascinating outcomes of this is that I got a lot of private messages from a lot of successful entrepreneurs who all said something along the lines of, like a lot of people that the people in this crowd probably know, and all said something along the lines of like, wish I could pretend I didn't know what you were talking about.
Yeah.
And it just made me realize in that moment, like, this is, again, like absurdly common.
I think that's, I was on the plane, I saw the thread, which started to be, I don't know if you have any numbers, dozens, hundreds, it just started going and going and going and going, and you were in a conversation. I don't remember.
Yeah, it was great for my follower count.
Anyhow, I started going and seeing this, and I felt so bad I know what it's like. A friend was going through this, or anybody's going through this. And so I was actually belabored for like 20 minutes on the plane. Do I post publicly? What could I say? What would be appropriate? What would be right? What would be helpful? And then I just sent you an email. Wow. And that's where we started a back and forth thread. And a lot of people voiced that they thanked you for sharing that.
Yeah, which made me feel great, actually.
But now that it's out, and you look back at, so maybe talking about the investors. So first question, actually, most important thing. You mentioned earlier, there's a lot of negative results. There's only a small percentage of successes. We're all trying to build businesses here or build technology here or create content for to be used in technology, et cetera. But are you going to do another one?
Oh, yeah, I would totally do it again.
Okay, so after all these ups, exactly, perfect. I was assuming that was your response because there's only one answer for a true entrepreneur.
Yeah.
But now, looking back at that, what would you do differently next time?
So we covered the one point, right, which is I would have had a lot more independence, and this is something I think comes with age too.
But independence
from the board, or at least a recognition. So I would have set things up better,
right,
so that I would have been able to maintain control, right, because I understand how to do that now. And then I would have actually maintained control, because it's not just about the percentage ownership or how much money's been invested. It's also about the more subtle sort of social ways in which investors can create pressure on you. I mean, at the time that we gave up the CEO-ship of GetSatisfaction, technically, like, we still owned more than 50% of the company. Like, we didn't have to do that. It was far more the sort of intimidation factor of it that made us do it than anything else. And I just feel much more prepared for that sort of thing these days, I think.
Yeah, I had a similar situation where, unfortunately, we almost had a sale, a big sale, and it blew up at the 12th hour, and everybody pointed fingers. And the company was struggling on some financials for transition management, which wasn't going well, which was my fault. And all of a sudden, there was a transition where the top investors in the board and people and the CEO said, it's best if you don't come into the office after you transition to chairman. It's best for everybody. And actually, it was a very difficult period, because I wanted to do what everybody thought was best for everybody. And I'm not sure that was the right decision. I'm not sure what is the right decision there. But evacuating, and being forced to evacuate or persuaded to evacuate, is a very similar thing. Learning, hindsight is 2020, but now after that situation, which was a disaster and the wrong thing to do, there would have been other ways to improve that solution or transition. How else can we learn if it's not from our own challenges? Is it advisors? How do we know which ones are the right advisors? Is it just we have to go through this crap and we become better out the other side, and hopefully it's not disastrous?
Well, I definitely think learning from other people's experience is better than learning from your own experience.
But all right, that's a fucking rhetorical question. And I cursed. See, I knew it would come out when I started talking about this. But so how would you answer that differently?
I would definitely have, if I were doing this again today, I would definitely have a much stronger support network than I had. I mean, there just weren't as many of you in 2008 and 2009, honestly. Mm-hmm. I would definitely, if I were doing it these days, build a much stronger support network. Or I might have come up through a much stronger support network, like, say, a sort of an accelerator type structure that gave me access to other people that I could talk to and work with. I think that is huge. The other thing I would do differently today is I wouldn't panic as much as I did then.
I panicked all the time. I thought it was the end of life every week.
Yeah, and now I'm like, well, it's just a company.
So one of the things I love now, or try to do now, is after that, I had part of one company that went public and others that didn't do well in this disaster. And being a mentor at about 5 accelerators, trying to help others avoid the mistakes that I did. You can't dictate. You can only tell stories and help them. And that's the same thing I do as an investor. And you've met some investors now that you would definitely work with in the future. And you probably have signals that say, oh, no, not there. Right? And so tell us a little bit of how you would choose those signals. And then we've got a couple minutes left and to kind of wrap up. But this is a fantastic kind of discussion to help others avoid the mistakes that we might have made.
I just think, your investors are essentially your boss, right? Like, for all the in this industry about how you get to be your own boss, that's really not true. I mean, you have people that you report to, right? And your investors are those. And so, like any situation where you're going to have a boss, the question is, like, do you like and trust this person? I mean, at the end of the day, that's really what it comes down to. Are you able to communicate with them in a way that feels meaningful? Have they done things? Have they said things that are indicative to you in some way, shape, or form that you can trust them, right? Do they talk about things as if they were experienced, right? Do they have an experience that you can relate to? Because that's one of the fastest ways that you can sort of form a trust relationship with somebody. I think that's the reason that Josh and probably you are successful with a lot of the companies that you invest in, is because that resonates with them. I just look for that sort of human connection in this situation and some sign that they're not just some sort of like autonomic bottom feeder that's like over there just trying to sort of take what they can and then run off, which unfortunately the business world has quite a few of.
Right. I think it's great advice. We could talk for a long time, but I want to kind of end on anything else that, from your experience, what you've learned now, that you would give advice, concrete advice to anybody else in the audience that is either building or wants to build a company.
Yeah, I think about it like I think you're better off when you think about like venture capital as a game, or taking venture capital as a game. I recognize that it has all sorts of real-world inputs, that for a lot of people, actually starting companies is one of the ways that they sort of aspire to kind of class jump, which is very hard to do in this country. We have a surprisingly static class system, and Silicon Valley is still very aspirationally one of the ways that you can do that. So you're thinking about your future, you're thinking about the people that care about you, you're thinking about, there's all sorts of reasons. So I recognize the gravity of it. At the same time, you are going to be better off if you can treat it as if it wasn't the most important thing in the world. You know what I mean? Like, entrepreneurs are always at a disadvantage in negotiating situations with investors because the person who wins a negotiation is always the person who has less of an emotional investment. Always. Like, you can go into any negotiation, and if you have more of an emotional investment, you will lose, right? That's just kind of the deal. So you have to figure out how to manage that. And to me, managing that means pulling yourself away from it as much as possible, looking at the situation dispassionately, and understanding that if it's a game, there are rules. It is a system. It's kind of a weird game because some of the rules aren't necessarily as apparent to you as others. And it's a matter of, like, if you can treat it as a game, understanding the system and the system dynamics, understanding the other person and their motivations and intentions, understanding where they're going to align or not align with yours. Not, on the one hand, I want to say, like, get to know that person as a person and trust them. And on the other hand, I want to say, step back from the situation and recognize that it's not just about the two of you as individuals, it's actually about the system that you're participating in and, like, the expectations that you have and that your LPs have and returns on capital and the larger macroeconomic situation. So it sounds like
it's both. And so you have to do both. And there's a fine line between get to really know them and take the perspective from far out. And I think that's fantastic advice, but it's not only probably advice for investors. It's probably everything in life. But in this situation, investors, co-founders, it's very critical to have that view without blinders on.
Yeah, I don't think it's surprising that so many of the teams that manage, like startup founding teams that manage to build these sort of wild, successful companies, they're on their second or their third or even their fourth company before it kind of hits. And the Twitter team is a great example of this, right? Like, it is the act of working with these people over time, learning their strengths and their weaknesses, figuring out how you can trust them, figuring out where you can lean on them, that makes you that successful. And I have no doubt that that's true of repeat investments as well.
Right. This has been fantastic. Thanks for sharing the ups and the downs and the transparency. You're going to be here for the rest of today.
Yeah, I'll be around.
And so others, if you have questions, we don't have any more time right now, but Lane is here. He's fantastic. Thank you for sharing, and enjoy the rest of the show.
Cool. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Lane.
Thanks, everybody.
Round of applause, guys. Thank you.